Hi, welcome to another edition of Coaching Conversations. We were talking about recently solving problems, dealing with problems, and Jill, you mentioned this cool model that you had developed and used. Would love to have you talk with us a little bit more about the genesis of that and then maybe walk us through the model.
Yeah, that sounds great. So this is a model that was used a while ago when I was working in a healthcare company. And it was really used to help the teams that we were working with try to identify and solve problems. So it can be used individually, but it can also be used in sort of a long range 6-month or year program. And so I'd love to walk you through the model and the sort of components of it. So really we're sort of calling it a tool for problem solving. And the first thing with any problem, and I always think of problems in organizations can be the people, the process, or the product that we're working with. But how do we define the problem? What are you trying to solve? And sometimes the problem doesn't need to be solved. So that's the first thing to think about. If we do have a problem, what is the goal that we're trying to get to? And in many ways, when we have our goal, we can drill down to say, how do we make the goal smart? So we talk about, is it specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound? So once we've defined the problem, the next thing is to gather data. When we're gathering data, it's really important to be aware of our biases. We all have biases and they can often show up without us knowing. And one of the ways to look at that is to try to understand what the bias is and try to find tools to get to the root cause. So for example, one of the great references around the work of our brains comes from Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And in that book, there's a reference to a system 1 thinking and a system 2. System 1 is our fast automatic response. It's what happens when we step onto the road and a fast car comes and we step back. System 2 is our much more intentional way of thinking. It's what we have to do when we balance our checkbook. So we're looking at data and trying to find sort of some parallels to data. We have to go into system 2. So in order to mitigate bias, it's really be aware of these first responses, and then be aware of how we can slow down our mind to think more intentionally. So one of the tools we think about with finding root cause is the 5 Whys tool. It's a great tool. It's a quick tool. I'll give you an example of how this might work. You might have said, gosh, I was late for work this morning. Why? Well, I didn't set my alarm clock. Why? Well, I didn't change the batteries. Why? I was too busy. Why? Because I'm homeschooling and working at the same time. So now we find the root cause, and the way then is to think, well, what's the solution? So the solution might be, I'm going to prepare the night before, make a list of what I need to do, and articulate and talk to my kids about when I can be available and when I cannot be available. So once we've gathered data, we need to decide on a plan of action. That could be as simple as, who needs to know? What do we need to do? When and where? And once we've gathered that data, we can then move more towards taking action and reflecting on the action. And those things can be quick or they can be slow. And it's really a sort of, in process improvement, we talk about PDSA, which is Plan, Do, Study, Act. And there's many different cycles we can use to think about how we're going to test something, review it, and then sort of refine what we need to do. So that's the model. It's a tool for problem solving. And I'd love to hear a little bit more, Louisa and Carol, about, ways you've used this tool as well.
Yeah, I love this. I mean, I obviously haven't seen the tool until today, so thank you so much for sharing it with us. But I have used similar types of things. And I think another place where, you gave us sort of a specific example of an individual solving a problem, but it absolutely would work with a team as well, as you mentioned. And I think one thing you'd want to maybe think about layering in with it would be some sort of accountability tool that would help you keep track of who's doing what. And I in particular like the RACI model, which is who's responsible, who's accountable, who needs to be consulted, and who needs to be informed. And it kind of gives you a way to, as you're laying out, working through the problem and the steps that need to be happening, to make sure that you are clear on who's doing what and by when. So it kind of gives you another thing you could layer on top of your problem solving tool would be like an accountability tool. I think that would be useful as well.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I love that.
And I think that the whole piece around accountability or responsibility of team members or an individual in terms of problem solving is I loved how, you talked about the plan, do, study, act, but that sort of final piece, we often just finish the situation, solve the problem, and move on because we're so busy, we don't have time. But I think there's a couple pieces of that that are really important to do. If you're working with a team, that you stop and celebrate successes. What did we achieve? How did we get through this tough point in time? Is really important to do as an individual and as a team. It's also important to stop back and reflect.
Yes.
What happened? What didn't happen? And
Yeah.
what did we learn from it? Or more importantly, what are we going to do next time? The U.S. Army War College and West Point as well have used AARs, after action reviews. We could spend a whole nother podcast video on AARs, but this whole view of after action review, what happened, more on what didn't happen, and most importantly, on what are we going to do next time. And then that's a whole piece around, as you mentioned earlier, Jill, the habit formation. Yeah. How do we create habits so that we did something, we learned something from it, and what are we going to do as we go forward?
Yeah, I love that. I think about one of the ways in which we sometimes solve problems is to think about the people that are in the problem. And yet when we can sort of bring together teams that are diverse in their thinking, in their roles, in their responsibilities, then we create this divergent thinking. And then we're thinking of solving problems in a different way. And that after action review enables us to hit the pause button, which we talk about so much in coaching, reflect on what's happened, and then think of maybe a different way to do something.
Yeah, and to make sure that you document that learning in such a way that it's in front of you and you're aware of it the next time you go to do something similar. I think sometimes things can get lost. I had one client who we did a nice after action review, a debrief after a big project was finished. And it was an excellent process to sort of gather the data and what did people think worked? What did they think they need to do differently next time? But then we needed to make sure that that carried forward so that a year down the road, when they're going through the process again, are they going to remember what they said? So you do need to make sure that you have a good process in place to make sure that you carry that information forward.
Yeah. And one last thing I'd add is this whole process of who is doing it. To think about, you never need to be alone in this process, even if it's your own problem to solve. Yeah. If it's part of a team, it's really critical. And even from an individual standpoint, to think about your stakeholders. Who is going to be affected by this? Who is interested in this? Who's accountable for it? Are all critical components to realize that you're not on an island by yourself. And you don't need to be either, because sometimes having a think partner to solve that problem can make a big difference. Like I get to tap into you guys all the time about solving problems that I'm dealing with, could come to solution. Right. So I want to thank everybody here today, again, for joining us for a coaching conversation. We hope it's helpful. Take good care.